The crux of what we're going to say today is those with autism spectrum disorder do well if they can. Ross Greene wrote The Explosive Child, and though he wasn't specifically talking about autism, he's the one that has come up with the phrase, children do well if they can. And that is pretty much everybody who's working with autism or neurological problems are trying to get out. Just that simple phrase to let teachers know, pediatricians know, everybody know. Our kids do well if they can. And if something's happening, then something is not working within themselves. Our folks do not misbehave on purpose. Their behavior has a purpose, and their behavior is communicated. Understanding autism. Autism starts with a genetic predisposition. Just like asthma or some of the genetically based conditions. Autism does not occur because of a result of something outside. It's a genetic predisposition. It takes a man and a woman and a genetic, it's a complex kind of thing that they haven't really figured out, come together, and I don't think they will. Now we think, and pretty much know, that it becomes actualized and becomes into the manifested into autism because of atypical brain growth that is triggered prenatally. Before the age of 2, most brains of autism spectrum disorder experience a brain growth spurt in the cerebral cortex, and the circumference measures larger. And we're going to be talking about that. Not every autistic child has a larger brain, but we think that those that start with language or seem to be developing normally is called regressive. Those folks that become regressive from development have an abnormal brain growth. What we know now is that for our autistic folks, especially the folks that develop normally and then have regression, the tissues, it's called gray matter, the tissues are continue to develop, and they become very connected and healthy, but in an autistic brain, they don't stop developing. And so they keep developing, so the head gets larger, the skull firms up, it keeps developing, so it kind of starts to infold, and the tissues become tighter, and they come closer together, and they become very, very smart. The whole brain becomes very, very smart. So there's more surface area in the cortex with greater convolutions and infolding of tissues present than those without autism spectrum disorders. Children without autism spectrum disorders begin to develop connections between the brain. So once the skull kind of pushes against the brain, the brain triggers, okay, I've developed enough, because the skull is kind of, and then say, okay, now we'll start developing the connections between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe and parietal lobe. But in our autistic folks, they keep developing this gray matter. Overvolume affects the brain functions. Too many connections in the frontal lobe, too many convolutions, too much infolding, and too few distance links. These are called axons in the white matter. We'll get more to it, so it's okay. Gray cortex, and gray matter is the cerebral cortex. The white matter is where the connections are. So too few long distance links between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain appears to result in language differences or inability to talk, to have speech. Social problems, the inability to understand nuances, inability to know how your behavior affects other people, that takes connections. And over-focus and or repetitive behavior or obsessive compulsive tendencies takes connections. And we now know that these are key problems or it's not problems, I'm not gonna say that, manifest behaviors in autism, and we now can directly connect them. But because the presenting manifestation of autism is language, social, and repetitive behavior, that's where most of the focus is at the moment, realizing that other parts of the brain are underconnected, but the frontal to the occipital has to do with the social difficulties, and that's often the most visual. Upside of having a bigger brain lends itself to hyper-awareness of incoming information and quick learning. And that's because the cerebral cortex gray matter is stronger, more stimulated, more receiving information than us. But okay, so you have this over-volume brain that's getting this overstimulation. The connections to the other parts of the brain are either not stimulating, they're weak, they're not going long enough, there's not as many, something's happening. So the brain can't use them as a diffuser. Because if you get this overstimulation, the brain typically will go through the amygdala, where the emotion is, or go to a different part and diffuse the stimuli. Our folks have it sitting in their cortex, and they can't get rid of it, except through calming strategies, their own coping strategies, their meltdowns, which we're going to talk a lot about. So they have this stimuli, and if it's about a thought or an interest they're interested in, it's okay. But if it's an overstimulation of stimuli, it just sits there, it gets worse and worse. To respond successfully with complex coping behavior strategies, the individual needs long-range connections within the brain, front to back and front to side. And it's not that our folks don't have them, they're underconnected. Every aspect isn't true for everybody, but when we see a disconnect in a person with autism, it's probably one of those brain connections.